The morning William packed her trunk, the house at Crestfield Row had already stopped feeling like a place anyone lived. The family had left for Lisbon 6 days earlier, and in 6 days the rooms had become something else entirely. Not abandoned exactly, more like held breath. The silver was wrapped and crated. The kitchen shelves stood bare down to the grain of the wood. 11 years of maintaining a house to a particular standard, of knowing which drawer held the good scissors, and which radiator knocked at 2 in the morning, and which of the children preferred their eggs soft rather than firm. And it had come to this. A Tuesday in November, with grey light at the windows, and a set of keys she would have to leave on the hall table before she locked the front door behind her. She had £43 left in her account. She had a reference letter from Mrs. Holt, which was a good one, and a small room in a terrace flat she shared with her sister Ruth, in the part of the city where the buses ran infrequently and the neighbours kept their curtains closed. She had 11 years of service that had produced in her an exact knowledge of how to care for other people's things, and a corresponding difficulty in explaining what, precisely, she was for when there were no other people's things to care for. She lifted the trunk. She left the keys on the hall table. She did not look back at the house from the pavement, because looking back was a particular kind of self-indulgence she had never been able to afford. Ruth was at the kitchen table when William arrived, a mug of tea steaming in front of her, and the morning paper open to no particular page. Ruth was 4 years older and had the quality, rare and useful, of receiving difficult news without rearranging her face into an expression of sympathy that would have made it worse. She looked at the trunk. She looked at William. She poured a second mug and pushed it across the table. "Did you eat?" she said. "On the train." "That means no." Ruth made toast. They ate it standing at the counter because the kitchen was too small for both of them to sit, and neither of them mentioned it because it had always been too small for both of them to sit, and mentioning it would have changed nothing. William told her about Crestfield Row and the crated silver and the £43, and Ruth listened with the patient economy of someone who already knew the situation and was simply waiting for her sister to arrive at it by herself. "The agency rang," Ruth said when William had finished. "Which agency?" "The Voss one. The woman called twice." William knew the Voss agency. Miriam Voss had built her domestic placement business over 20 years on the model of a woman who understood, better than most, that desperation was a renewable resource. She placed housekeepers, cooks, estate managers, and companions in private households across the county, and she charged her clients well and charged her placed staff equally, extracting £30 weekly from wages as a placement fee for the first year of any engagement. The fee was legal. It was also, in William's considered opinion, designed to ensure that anyone placed through Miriam's agency remained financially grateful for long enough to become financially dependent. "I'm not interested," William said. "She has a position at an estate, Ashwood, out past the valley, 40 minutes on the rail line." "I heard you." "William." Ruth said it quietly, which was how Ruth said things when she meant them most. "You have £43. The figure sat there between them for a moment. £43, a good reference letter, and an apartment that was too small for 2 adults to sit at a table together. William drank her tea. She went to see Miriam Voss 2 days later, not because she had changed her mind about the fee arrangement, but because she had run the arithmetic 4 times and arrived at the same result each time. Miriam was a woman in her mid-50s who had learned to use the silence at the beginning of an interview as a demonstration of who held the calendar. She made William wait 30 seconds before lifting her eyes from the folder, and when she did, she looked at William with the assessing attention of someone evaluating a piece of furniture for resale. "You're the one who turned us down last week," she said. "I had reservations about the terms." "The terms are standard." They're your standard. Miriam smiled the way people smiled when they considered the person across from them to be saying something technically true, but practically irrelevant. Ashwood is a substantial estate. The position has been difficult to fill. The previous housekeeper left after 8 months. She paused to let that land. The household requires someone settled, someone with experience in managing a large property without constant oversight. She closed the folder. I thought of you. William considered the compliment. It was, she recognized, structured to make refusal feel like ingratitude. I'd like to see the property before I agree to anything, she said. Of course. Miriam slid a card across the desk. I'll arrange a tour for Thursday. The caretaker will show you around. The master is not currently in residence. She added that last sentence with a faint emphasis, as though the master's absence were itself a form of consideration. Thursday was cold and clear in the way that late autumn days sometimes became clear when the warmth was fully gone and the sky had nothing left to filter. William took the 8:47 rail from the city, changed at the Valley Junction, and arrived at the station nearest to Ashwood just after 9:30. The estate was reached by a lane that turned off the main road a quarter-mile from the station. The lane ran between hedgerows that had been cut back for winter and opened eventually onto a gravel forecourt with a view of the house beyond it. Ashwood was not the kind of house that announced itself. It was large, without being ostentatious, built in pale stone that had taken on, over the years, the particular colour of old maps, with a slate roof and windows that reflected the morning sky in wide grey panels. The gardens to the left of the forecourt were formal at the edges and less formal toward the back, where an orchard ran down to a stone wall and the visible suggestion of a kitchen garden beyond. William stood at the forecourt gate for a moment and looked at it. She had worked in houses she liked and houses she hadn't, and she could usually tell in the first 5 minutes which was which, by some combination of the light in the windows and the state of the paths, and the quality of quiet the place carried. Ashwood's quiet was not neglect. It was the quiet of a house that had been tended consistently and had developed, over time, a kind of settled patience. She found she was willing to go in. A figure was working along the near edge of the kitchen garden wall as she came around the side of the house, checking the mortar at the base of the stonework with what looked like a wooden-handled tool, moving with the focused unhurry of someone who knew the work well. He was dressed in plain dark cord trousers and a heavy wool coat that showed the outdoor life in its elbows, and he was not wearing gloves despite the cold. He straightened when he heard her footsteps on the path and turned to face her. He was perhaps 35, with an even, considered face, and the kind of stillness in his posture that read as unhurried rather than slow. He looked at her without the particular performing quality of someone who had been told a prospective housekeeper was coming and intended to make an impression. "You must be here for the tour," he said. "William Chambers." He nodded once. "I'll show you around." He did not offer his own name, and she did not ask, because the agency card had said the caretaker would show her around, and it had not said there would be introductions. His name, she would learn much later, was Daniel. But that was later. He showed her the house methodically and with a specific attention she found, unexpectedly, restful. He knew where the damp came in above the east corridor window and had already arranged for someone to look at it. He knew which section of the back staircase needed a new tread and approximately when the work had been scheduled. He knew the kitchen range had been serviced the previous spring and that the airing cupboard on the second floor retained heat better than it should, which was a ventilation question worth addressing. He was not performing the knowledge. He simply had it. She asked careful questions and he gave careful answers, and by the time they reached the kitchen garden properly, an hour had passed without either of them noticing it particularly. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, but not carelessly. The beds were mulched and edged. The espaliered pear trees along the south wall had been pruned into clean, flat shapes. There was a wooden bench set against the wall where, she suspected, someone had sat in summer to be in the sun. William had packed her lunch that morning in a cloth-wrapped parcel because the journey was long and she was not confident of a cafe near the station. She sat on the bench to eat it, partly because the bench was there and the day was bright if not warm, and partly because her feet had taken the frost-hard path with rather less comfort than she had expected from those shoes. Daniel was noting something in a small pocket notebook at the far end of the garden when she unwrapped the parcel. She looked across. "Have you eaten?" she said. He looked up. "I'll find something later." "There's enough." There was half a cheese sandwich and a slice of fruit loaf and a small apple, which was enough for one person and adequate for two if neither was particularly hungry. She held the parcel open toward him, not as a gesture with any significance attached, simply as what you did when there was enough and someone else was there. He crossed the garden and sat at the other end of the bench and accepted the half of the sandwich she offered him. He ate it without ceremony. She ate the other half. "Have you worked here long?" she said. "Long enough to know what needs doing," he said. It was, she thought, a slightly particular answer to a simple question. She let it go. They finished their lunch. He folded the cloth neatly and handed it back to her. They went in to see the upper floor rooms. The position was offered to her the following Monday through a letter from the agency, and the terms were different from the ones Miriam had first described. The placement fee deduction had been reduced to £15 weekly for the first 6 months, rather than 30 for the first year. The accommodation in the estate cottage was included. There was a formal set of duties that was specific and reasonable, with no suggestion of the creeping scope that had trapped the previous housekeeper. William read the letter twice, and then a third time because the third reading was the one where she stopped looking for the catch and began to consider whether there wasn't one. Ruth read it over her shoulder. "Someone adjusted those terms," she said. "The agency. Miriam Voss has never voluntarily reduced a fee in her professional life." William folded the letter. "Someone in the household, then." Ruth said nothing to that, which was how Ruth indicated that she thought William was right about something she had not yet fully considered. William accepted the position. She wrote to Miriam to confirm, and she took the rail line to Ashwood on the 3rd Monday in November, with her trunk and her reference letter, and £28, which was what remained after she had paid Ruth her share of that month's rent and the cost of the train ticket. The estate cottage was smaller than the main house, but solid and dry, with a cast-iron range that heated the front room properly, and a bedroom window that looked out over the kitchen garden. She unpacked her trunk with the same economy she had packed it. She put her few books on the shelf above the range. She set her mother's small blue picture on the windowsill because she had carried it through 11 years at Crestfield Row, and there was no reason to stop now. She met the cook, a steady woman named Mrs. Hartley, on the first morning, and the 2 under-housemaids, and the man who looked after the grounds when he was not occupied elsewhere. She did not see the caretaker from the tour, and when she mentioned him to Mrs. Hartley, the cook looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and said, "You mean Mr. Ashford?" And when William said she didn't know his name, Mrs. Hartley said only, "He comes and goes," and changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had learned not to complete certain sentences. The first week established the rhythms. The second week deepened them. William found she knew this kind of house. Not this specific house, but the kind. The way a large stone building held cold in the back corridor, even when every room was heated. The way a kitchen garden needed a second pair of eyes in winter to catch what the gardener had stopped seeing. the way a household of several staff ran on the invisible currency of small, kept promises and small, acknowledged efforts. She understood the work. The work, she found, was interesting. She saw Daniel twice in the first fortnight. The first time was across the forecourt, from an upstairs window, where she caught the shape of him moving between the outbuildings, with the same purposeful economy she had registered on the tour. She did not call down or wave. He was occupied. So was she. The second time was in the library, which she was cataloguing against the household inventory, a task the previous housekeeper had not completed. She was on the third shelf from the top of the far wall, standing on the library steps with a notebook braced against her forearm, when the door opened and he came in. He stopped when he saw her. She registered, without making anything particular of it, that he was dressed differently than on the tour, better, though still plainly, in a dark jacket and good wool trousers with no suggestion of a working morning about them. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "The inventory was incomplete," she said, without coming down the steps, because she had reached a good place in the third shelf, and descending would have meant losing her count. "I can leave if you need the room." "No." He crossed to the desk near the window, turned the desk chair to face the shelves rather than the door, and sat down. He picked up a book from the desk that she had not noticed, and he read. She finished the third shelf and started the fourth. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms with a lot of books tended to be quiet. A quality of absorbed sound that made the silence feel occupied rather than empty. She did not find it uncomfortable. "Are you managing all right?" he said eventually, without looking up from the book. "With the inventory?" "With the position generally?" She considered the question, because it was the kind of question that didn't always mean what it said. "Yes," she said. "It's a well-ordered house." "It hasn't always been." "No, but it is now." He went back to his book. She finished the fourth shelf. When she came down the steps to consult the base catalogue, she found that he had left the room at some point without her noticing, as quietly as he had sat down. The thing that changed happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the 5th week, when William was crossing the servants' passage that ran between the kitchen stores and the back utility room. The passage was L-shaped, and sound moved around the corner of it in ways that were probably not intended. Miriam Voss had come to Ashwood that afternoon for what she had described in her note as a routine placement check, and William had shown her around with brisk professionalism and offered her tea, which Miriam had accepted while looking at everything with the proprietary attention of someone taking stock of her own investment. Miriam had brought with her a junior colleague from the agency, a young woman named Claire, who carried a clipboard and said almost nothing. It was to Claire that Miriam was speaking when William came around the corner of the passage and stopped. "She'll last," Miriam was saying, in the comfortable voice of someone who didn't expect to be overheard, "because she has nowhere else to go. That's why I sent her here." 3 other placements refused it outright, and Chambers was desperate enough to reconsider once the rent pressure mounted. A pause, the sound of a heel on stone. Difficult to place, difficult to reason with, and too principled to be straightforward, but useful in a position nobody else wanted. The junior woman's voice, quiet. Does she know that? Why would she need to? William stood in the passage for a very exact moment. The cold of the stone floor came up through her shoes. The single bulb above her cast a precise circle of light on the flags. She could hear the tick of the kitchen clock from the other side of the store's door. She turned and went back the way she had come. She went to the cottage and sat in the chair beside the range and looked at the blue picture on the windowsill. For a long time. Ruth had told her once, during a different, difficult year, that the worst kind of information was the kind that didn't change anything about your situation, but changed everything about how you were required to feel about it. This was that kind. She had not been placed at Ashwood because she was suited to it. She had been disposed here like a difficult piece of furniture that a conscientious dealer had found a buyer for at last. That night, she wrote to Ruth. She told her what she had heard, not in distress, but in the precise way she wrote to Ruth when she needed someone to hold the facts steady while she worked out what to do with them. Ruth wrote back the following day, not by post, which would have been too slow, but by telephone, which meant William took the call in the estate cottage at 7 in the morning, with her tea going cold beside her. "Are you going to leave?" Ruth said. "I don't know yet." "The house is the problem or the woman?" "The woman." "Then leave the woman, not the house." Ruth paused. "The position is real regardless of how Miriam arranged it. The revised terms are real. The work is real. None of that changed because Miriam's motives were shabby. She described me as difficult to reason with. You are difficult to reason with when someone's reasoning is poor." A brief silence. "The question is whether you can stay under the same arrangement with someone you now know to be that kind of person." William looked out the cottage window at the kitchen garden. The frost was thinner that morning. The espaliered pears against the south wall had a particular bare-branched geometry that she had begun, over 5 weeks, to find she liked. "No," she said, "not under the same arrangement." She thought for 3 more days. She walked the estate grounds in the evenings, which she had fallen into as a habit. The forecourt, the formal garden, the kitchen garden, and then back along the lane that ran beside the orchard, where the stone wall glowed pale in the winter light at dusk. She catalogued 2 more shelves of the library. She supervised the rescheduled repair to the east corridor window, which the workmen completed in 4 hours on a cold Wednesday morning, and she checked their work afterward and found it sound. On the 4th day she wrote a letter. It was addressed to Miriam Voss at the agency office. It stated, in clear language and without elaboration, that William was terminating her relationship with Voss Domestic Placements with immediate effect, and that accordingly the placement fee arrangement detailed in her contract was dissolved. She noted that she was not terminating her position at Ashwood, which she understood to be a matter between herself and the estate's household directly, but that she considered her obligation to the agency to be at an end. She did not explain why. Miriam would know why, or she wouldn't, and William found she didn't much mind which. She posted it on the way to the estate house Thursday morning. She felt crossing the forecourt with the day's household tasks in hand. Not lighter exactly, but squarer. She had done what she could do, and she had done it in writing, which was the form appropriate to business matters. What she did not know, because she had no way to know it, was that Miriam Voss received the letter at 9 on Friday morning, and read it twice, and then rang the estate directly and was told by Mrs. Hartley that the household did not handle agency matters, and that any such inquiries should be directed to Mr. Ashford's solicitor. William had no knowledge of any of that. She was cataloguing the 5th shelf of the library and thinking about the ventilation question in the 2nd-floor airing cupboard. Miriam arrived at Ashwood on the following Monday without an appointment, which was the first unusual thing, and she brought Claire with her again, which suggested she intended the visit to carry some weight. She told Mrs. Hartley at the kitchen door that she was there to discuss William's employment situation and that she required to speak with the household's representative immediately. Mrs. Hartley showed her to the drawing room with her precise professional neutrality and went to find William. William came to the drawing room and found Miriam already arranged near the window with the specific posture of someone who had decided in advance where they would stand for this conversation. "Miss Chambers," Miriam said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "I don't believe there has," William said. "Your contract with the agency was terminated in writing on Thursday." Miriam's face shifted in the way faces shifted when the prepared argument met a fact it had not accounted for. You can't simply end an agency arrangement unilaterally. The placement fee is a contractual obligation between myself and Voss Placements. I've terminated that contract. If there are grounds for a dispute about notice or fees already paid, I'd suggest you raise them through the appropriate channels. William's voice was even. It had never required effort to make it even. That was simply how it arrived when she needed it. I am the appropriate channel, Miriam said with the careful sharpness of someone who understood she was losing ground, but had not yet acknowledged it. Then I've addressed you in the appropriate form. The door to the drawing room opened at that moment, and Gerald Pace came in, which changed the room entirely, though no one spoke for 3 seconds. Gerald was a man in his 60s with the measured gait and the good quality coat of a solicitor who had practiced long enough to have developed a particular authority that required no announcement. He was carrying a flat leather case. He looked at Miriam, at Claire, at William, and then at Miriam again. "Miss Voss," he said in a tone of mild surprise. "I wasn't aware there was a pre-existing appointment." "There isn't," Miriam said. "I'm here on agency business." "Yes." Gerald set his case on the side table near the door and opened it with a practiced efficiency that was itself a kind of quiet remark. "I've come for the household matters as well. I'm here on behalf of the estate." He removed a set of documents in a neat sheaf. "On behalf of Mr. Daniel Ashford Chambers," he said, with the particular unhurried precision of a man reading a formal name from a formal document, whose estate Ashwood is and has been for the past 7 years, and who asked me to finalise the employment documentation for Miss William Chambers's position, as the arrangement previously negotiated through your agency is being brought in-house. Miriam's face did something complicated. William heard the name. She heard it the way you heard a sound that was both familiar and entirely new. And she stood for a moment with the simple fact of it moving through her in the stillness of the drawing room. Daniel. The man in the dark cord trousers at the garden wall. The man who had eaten half her sandwich on the bench in the winter kitchen garden. The man in the library chair who had asked whether she was managing and listened to her answer. The caretaker who knew where the damp came in and which section of the back staircase needed a new tread. Master of Ashwood. The position had always been his to offer, and he had arranged its terms himself, and he had never once suggested it. "That can't be correct," Miriam said. Her voice had a new quality. Not anger, but the particular thinness of someone whose assumptions have been removed from beneath them while they were still standing on them. "Mr. Ashford is in the north. He's been in the north for months." "He returned last week," Gerald said without looking up from the documents. "He asked me to thank you for placing Miss Chambers with the estate. He found the placement entirely satisfactory." "She terminated her agency contract." "Yes." Gerald arranged the sheaf into a neater stack. "The estate is replacing that arrangement with a direct employment contract under better terms. That's the purpose of my visit." He looked at Miriam then with the gentle, impersonal courtesy of a man who was delivering information and not an argument. "I believe that concludes the agency's involvement with Ashwood." Miriam opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at William, and in her face was the specific expression of someone attempting to locate an authority they were accustomed to having, and finding the shelf where it had stood entirely empty. "Miss Chambers," she began. William waited. Miriam said nothing further. There was, William recognized, nothing for her to say. She had described William to a young colleague in a passage where she had not expected to be heard, as useful in a position nobody else wanted. The position had turned out to be rather differently positioned than she had assessed. That was not William's problem to solve. Miriam gathered herself with the competence of someone who had maintained a professional face through more difficult situations than this one, and she said, to the room generally, that she would have her office send through the final accounting. And she left. Claire followed. The door closed behind them with less noise than any door closed in a moment of drama had any right to make. Gerald looked at William with the mild, interested expression of a man who had just witnessed something he had expected to witness, and found it very much as anticipated. "Shall we go through the documentation?" he said. "Yes," William said. "In a moment." She excused herself and crossed the entrance hall and went through the door to the east corridor, not to the kitchen garden, but to the shorter path that ran beside the house to the forecourt. She needed 30 seconds of cold air. Daniel was in the forecourt. He was standing near the gate with his hands in his coat pockets and the same unhurried composure she had registered that first morning, and he was watching her come toward him with the specific quality of someone who knew what was coming and was not attempting to control it. She stopped at a reasonable distance. She looked at him. "You were going to tell me eventually," she said. "Yes." "When?" "When it mattered," he said. "Or when you found it out first. Either would have done." She considered that. It was the kind of answer that was not an apology and not an excuse and not a performance. It was what it was. "The terms," she said, "the revised terms. You arranged those. The original terms were not reasonable. No. You said so the first time you turned the position down. I said nothing to you. I hadn't met you. You said it to the agency." A small, honest pause. "Miriam's staff are thorough record keepers. The file she brought on you was extensive." William absorbed this. Daniel Ashford Chambers had read a file on her that contained, presumably, her reference letter from Mrs. Holt and her 11 years at Crestfield Row and her initial refusal on principle and her financial circumstances. And he had revised the terms of a placement before she arrived, because he had read the file and formed a view about what was reasonable. And he had shown her around his own estate in a work coat and answered her questions about damp and staircases, with no indication that the answers were coming from the person who would ultimately be responsible for addressing all of it. "The sandwich," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the country adjacent to one. "The sandwich was not part of any plan," he said. "I was cold and you offered." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the same steadiness he had brought to everything she had observed of him. And she found, standing in the forecourt of his estate on a bright November morning, that she did not feel deceived so much as she felt the curious rearranging sensation of a room you thought you understood resolving into a slightly different shape. She said, "I sent my resignation to Miriam, not to the estate." "I know. The position is still mine if I want it." "On whatever terms you think are fair," he said. "Gerald has the draft. Read it when you're ready." She nodded once. She turned and went back into the house to read the draft. He stayed in the forecourt. Ruth came to Ashwood the following Saturday, travelling the 40 minutes on the rail line because William had written and asked her to come, and because Ruth, for all her unsentimental practicality, was not a person who refused an invitation when she understood the reason for it. William showed her the house, not as a prospective housekeeper, but as someone who lived there now and knew where things were and had opinions about them. She showed her the kitchen and the library and the kitchen garden with the bench against the south wall, and Ruth walked through it all with the careful attention she gave to anything she was deciding what to think about. After a while she said, "It's a good house." "Yes," William said. "He read your file." "Apparently." "And revised the terms before he'd met you." "Yes." Ruth looked at the espaliered pear trees against the south wall, their clean pruned branches pale against the stone. "You shared your lunch with him," she said. "There was enough." "William." Ruth turned to look at her sister with an expression of mild, affectionate exasperation. "Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" "Yes," William said. "I do." They had tea in the cottage after, with Mrs. Hartley's shortbread on a plate between them because Mrs. Hartley had sent it across when she heard William had a visitor, which was the kind of small, consistent hospitality that told you what you needed to know about a household's character. Gerald came into the library late that afternoon while William was finishing the catalogue. The 6th shelf done at last, and the 7th just begun. He paused at the door in the way people paused when they weren't sure if they were interrupting. "Miss Chambers, I wanted to explain something, if you had a moment." She came down the steps and sat in the desk chair, and he settled himself in the reading chair near the window, and he told her, in the careful, measured sentences of a man who had been asked to relay something and intended to relay it accurately, that Daniel had asked for the file because 3 previous housekeepers had left the position in under a year, and he had wanted to understand whether the difficulty was the position or the people Miriam had been placing in it. He had read William's file and concluded the difficulty was the terms and the manner in which the position had been presented, not the position itself. He had revised the terms before the tour. He had conducted the tour himself as the caretaker, because he had found over the years that people behaved differently when they did not know who they were speaking to, and he had wanted to see what she was like when nothing was at stake. He said, "The kitchen garden bench," Gerald added, with a slight cough that was not entirely a cough, was informative. William looked at the 6th shelf of the library for a moment. 11 years of knowing where someone else's scissors were kept. A trunk packed twice in a month. £43 and a good reference letter. Half a cheese sandwich on a cold November morning, because there was enough. "Thank you," she said to Gerald, meaning it. He nodded and took his leave, and she turned back to the 7th shelf. The formal employment contract arrived in its final version the following week, and she read it in the cottage at the table with the blue picture on the windowsill, and the winter light coming through the kitchen garden glass. The terms were straightforward and fair. There was no placement fee. The position included the cottage, a clear set of responsibilities, and a wage that bore a sensible relationship to the work required. She signed it with her full name in the space provided, and set it on the table and made herself a cup of tea, and she sat for a while just where she was. Ruth rang that evening. "Well," Ruth said, "I signed it." A small silence on the line, the companionable kind. "Good," Ruth said. "Are you all right?" "I think so," William said. "I'm still working out which parts of the last 7 weeks were what I thought they were." "Most of them," Ruth said. "That's usually how it is." Most was the right word. The work was what she had thought it was. The house was what it had appeared to be. The cook's shortbread was as good as it tasted the first time, and the second-floor airing cupboard remained a ventilation problem no one had yet fully resolved, and the kitchen garden bench was cold and solid and real. Daniel she was still working out, which seemed fair given that he had been working her out for some time, before she had the opportunity to return the consideration. He knocked at the cottage door 2 evenings later, which was unusual because in 5 weeks of proximity he had never done so. She opened the door to find him standing on the step with no particular purpose visible, and his hands in his coat pockets in the way she had begun to recognize as his resting posture. "I wanted to see how you were managing," he said. "You asked me that in the library." "You gave me the same answer you'd give anyone." She considered this. He was not wrong. She stepped back from the door. "There's tea," she said. He came in. He sat at the table and she made tea, and they sat across from each other in the small cottage kitchen with the blue pitcher between them on the windowsill catching the lamplight. And she asked him things she had not known she wanted to ask until the opportunity arrived. How long he had been at Ashwood, what the North had been, that he had been away for months, Whether the damp above the east corridor window had concerned him, as long as she suspected it had. He answered everything with the same plainness he had answered her questions on the tour, except that now the answers were complete in ways they hadn't been then, because the person answering them was not bracketing himself into a smaller frame. He was simply there, in her kitchen, with his tea. He said before he left that Gerald had mentioned she was cataloguing the library. Finishing what the previous housekeeper started, she said. She didn't start it. She filed things in the wrong order and left. A pause. I'd like it finished if you're willing. I'm already doing it. He nodded once. He put on his coat. He said goodnight and went out into the garden dark, and she listened to his footsteps on the frost-hard path, diminishing toward the house. She turned to rinse the cups. The blue pitcher stood in the window above the sink, pale and solid, the same pitcher she had carried through 11 years of Crestfield Row mornings and set in her trunk, 2 weeks running and placed on this particular sill because she had carried it far enough that she was entitled to stop carrying it. The kitchen garden bench would catch an hour of sun by February. She knew, if the winter broke at the right angle. She had been watching the way the light moved across the south wall from the cottage window in the mornings, and she had a reasonable sense of when it would happen. She finished rinsing the cups and set them on the rack and dried her hands on the cloth by the sink. The range ticked behind her. The garden beyond the window was very dark and very quiet, the way a cared-for place went quiet at the end of a day. She was home.